Resident Evil is a pretty popular franchise, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. It's got games, a live action movie series, an animated movie series, novel, manga, and even a stage play. It's also my favorite video game franchise ever. I'm what you could probably define as a fanboy. I own nearly every Resident Evil game, and I consistently enjoy the series through its ups and downs. Because when this series hits a high, it seems to not only generate a game that will somehow last through the ages, but it also manages to define a new genre standard. Now what I'm wanting to do is to go through every single Resident Evil game and try to explain what made the series so influential, as well as point out any positives and negatives that each game has and whether or not they still stand up today. This is the beginning of my Resident Evil retrospective. So, since this is the first part, I feel like it's kind of important to give a brief history as to what led up to the series, as well as point out a few names that'll likely be repeated several times throughout the entire retrospective. So, in 1989, there was a horror movie called Sweet Home, and a Capcom game designer named Takuro Fujiwara was licensed to make a video game adaptation of the movie. The game was a sort of horror RPG combo that focused on survival and puzzle solving, and it was highly praised by critics. In 1993, Fujiwara conceived the Resident Evil as a sort of remake of Sweet Home, and put the project in the hands of my man, Shinji motherfucking Mikami. See, Mikami is a legend. He has managed to attach his name to nearly all of my favorite games. The Resident Evil series, Goof Troop, Devil May Cry, Ace Attorney, Killer 7, Beautiful Joe. Do I need to go on? Anything with his name on it usually shows at least some degree of quality even nowadays, and he is a god at gameplay innovation and campy settings and dialogue. It would be fair to say that without him, several of these iconic games would not be anywhere near as memorable as they are today. Back to Resident Evil. The game was debuted in 1996 to high critical and commercial success. It was so successful and innovative that it coined the genre term survival horror. This genre was where you would, and this might shock you, survive several horror elements. The key point of the genre is usually that the player is more vulnerable to the enemies around you and that combat is not always the best option. The game exemplified this, and would continue to for a majority of its sequels. Resident Evil 6. So now that we know how Resident Evil came to be and what it managed to accomplish, let's look at the beginning of the series' journey on the PlayStation. The game begins in the town of Raccoon City. A bunch of crazy murders are occurring in the outskirts where the victims seem to be eaten. To investigate, the Raccoon City Police Department Special Tactics and Rescue Services, or STARS, are sent to the area of the murders. Bravo Team is sent in first, but they suck super hard, so Alpha Team is sent in to fix their shit. After searching the area and finding a corpse from the Bravo Team, a group of zombified dogs begins attacking Alpha, managing to kill one member who will never be mentioned again. The survivors flee into a mysterious nearby mansion, and then we are introduced to our cast in a manner that I could never hope to top.
Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, Albert Wesker, Resident Evil.
Once inside, the game's story actually changes depending on which character you chose at the start of the game. As a way of adding replay value as well as a sort of difficulty change, Resident Evil has two different campaigns to play through, both of which are actually non-canon to the overall story. One for Jill Valentine and one for Chris Redfield. Depending on whichever character is chosen, certain characters will disappear from the story. In Jill's campaign, Chris goes missing and she teams up frequently with Barry Burton. In Chris's campaign, Jill and Barry go missing, and he teams up with the sole survivor of Bravo Team, Rebecca Chambers. The only constant character is Albert Wesker, who meets up with our protagonists at a handful of points in the game. Back to the beginning, our protagonists venture into the nearby hall to investigate a gunshot, only to find a Bravo team member being eaten by a spooky zombie. From that point on, our main characters begin exploring the mansion to discover the secrets behind the monsters that wander the halls. Both stories are similar, but if I had to choose one that was preferable, it would be Jill's campaign. Jill frequently meets up with Barry, and the two have absolutely delightful conversations with each other.
Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things. Better take it with you.
But how about you, Barry?
I have this.
Thank you. I'll take this then.
By now I probably need to call attention to that glorious script and voice acting going on. See, the actual presentation of the story in the game is half-assed as hell. Apparently the actors playing the cast were all just a random assortment of Americans that Capcom pulled off the street, meaning that they had little to no experience with acting to begin with. Their full names don't even show up at the end of the credits, so it seems hilariously like nobody even wanted their name attached to this thing. The fruits of this lack of effort is some of the most enjoyable cutscenes to ever exist. Every cutscene is pure gold.
Richard, what happened?
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
I'll tell you right now, this is probably the best part of the game. Each scene is a bizarre mix of awkward writing and poor acting that manages to reach a level of campy goodness that I've never seen before outside of like independent movies.
Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? Rebecca!
We can also mix this in with the crazy emotive movements being performed by every character in the game. Since this is a PlayStation game, none of the characters actually have movable faces, meaning that all their emoting has to come from body language. Because of that, we get these characters that flail their arms around and do some of the corniest motions you've ever seen. It's a perfect storm of terrible. Anyways, at various points, Jill meets Barry and he lends a hand in some way, including helping Jill out of a trap room and giving us the ever so memorable Jill sandwich line.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Chris meets up with Rebecca, but more often than not, Rebecca is just saving Chris's dumb ass rather than being a cool bro like Barry. That isn't always the case though, as depending on what actions you perform, different events can occur. For example, in my playthrough I had Rebecca save Chris from a giant blood-sucking plant, and because of that, she was left in the greenhouse. If I had defeated the plant on my own, then Rebecca would still be in the mansion, where she would need my assistance from a hunter attack. Speaking of giant plants and hunters, as the two explore the mansion, they discover a number of horrible monsters besides just zombies. There are these zombie dogs named Cerberus, zombie sharks named Neptune, giant spiders, a plant that grows so big it takes over a greenhouse and starts attacking living things, bees, agile reptile monsters named Hunters, a giant snake named Yawn, fly-human hybrids called Chimeras, and more. With all these monsters, there is certainly a variety to keep the game going at a brisk speed, as well as details scattered around the game in the form of files that can be picked up explaining these monsters' creations. A good chunk of the game's story and atmospheres is found in these files. Most famously is the infamous Itchy Tasty Journal. It details the events of a scientist who worked on the zombie plague, the events that led up to the virus's accidental release, and the slow process of his infection as he slowly loses his sanity and the virus takes over his body. This journal is probably the perfect blend of atmosphere and storytelling, and it's honestly incredible that something this genuinely effective made it into a game with a script like this.
How about going down to check by yourself? I have a rope here.
Oh, do you? Well, then I'll try to go down using the rope.
Through files and exploration, we eventually learned that the zombie virus is codenamed the T-Virus, and was developed by a pharmaceutical company named Umbrella, who secretly makes biological weapons to sell, and that the mansion we're in is just a convoluted cover for their business. We also run into Wesker once in the greenhouse area, where when playing as Jill, he none too suddenly tells us that, "Oh man, that Barry sure is suspicious, you better watch out for that Barry, you're gonna get you, Barry." A bit further on, we discover Umbrella's hidden lab and we find our missing partner trapped in a cell.
Oh, Jill!
Oh, Chris! So you're okay?
Yeah,
You too!
Surprising no one, we also discover that Wesker has connections to Umbrella in this slideshow where it looks like Wesker's CGI model was badly photoshopped into a group photo. Progressing a little further, and Wesker reveals himself to be the head behind this whole ordeal and that he has a horrible monster prepared. And this is where things change depending on your actions previously in the game. You see, there are several opportunities for you to help or accept help from your campaign partner, and depending on your choices, they will either be dead, standing by your side while Wesker threatens you, or in Barry's case, help Wesker threaten you because he's being blackmailed. And if you did all the right actions, he will also help save you from Wesker. Yeah, that's actually kind of a weird part, because with Wesker knocked out, the characters don't have a good reason to check out that horrible monster that he was bragging about. So Barry just says, "Hey, Wesker said some vague thing about a monster. We should totally check it out for shits and giggles." Regardless, they find out that the monster is called the Tyrant, and the creature is awoken, usually killing Wesker in the process. A short boss battle ensues, and then the lab's self-destruct sequence is activated, something that is now considered a staple of the series. If the player has the right items, then they can free their partner and then escape. If the partner has failed to save any of the Good Stars members, then their campaign will get the bad ending, featuring a downtrodden team escaping in a helicopter. However, if the player has managed to save everybody, then at the end of the game, they will be greeted by the Tyrant once again. One final boss battle later, and the game ends with a good ending and an exhausted but triumphant team escaping from the facility. So, it might seem like I just skipped over a lot of stuff during that plot summary, but that's because the plot doesn't really have that much to offer. It's really more focused on the gameplay and the things that happen within the gameplay, but they don't really serve that much of a story purpose. You fight a giant snake at one point, that's cool, I guess. It's not very important to the story, but it happens. You find a dead body of a Bravo team member named Forrest. He's got a bazooka. Then you move on. There were crows. That happened. That's about it. The story doesn't serve that important of a purpose, and it really was taking a backseat to the gameplay. So, all things considered, this story kind of sucks. It's bog standard zombie crap. Maybe back then, in the year 1996, this could have been considered original, but by now, we've already heard this same old zombie story like a million times. It's not that interesting, and the story elements that they try to include aren't much better. All the main characters have one-note personalities, if they're lucky enough to have one at all. In Jill's story, they try to set up an obvious red herring with Barry, but the main bad guy ends up being the obvious black clothes-wearing, sunglass-wearing asshole that you barely see for most of the game. Ironically, the saving grace of this story is the way it's presented. The humorous cutscenes and acting are the sole reason why anybody should watch them, because if this story was made with competent actors and a halfway decent script, I don't think it would be worth watching. But Resident Evil didn't define a genre with its incredible storytelling, it did it with its incredible gameplay. The game consists of a mix of puzzle solving, item management, and strategic combat. Hidden around the mansion are various weapons, ammo types, health recovery, and key items. These key items are often found and need to be taken to a separate room to reveal yet another key item, which continues on finding more and more key items until it reaches a climax and leads the player into a new room where the process begins again. Along with everything else, there are 3 MO discs that are found throughout the game, and they need to be held onto until the end, where they can be used to free your kidnapped partner and thus get the good ending. Careful consideration has to be taken when holding key items because the player's inventory is very limited, with Jill having 8 free spaces and Chris only having 6. A player will usually at least need to hold on to one weapon to defend themselves, ammo for that weapon, health to heal any possible damage, and then the key item the player expects to use, but these can all vary depending on the knowledge and skill of the person playing. All of these items can be stored in chests that are found in safe rooms scattered around the mansion. Once an item is put inside of a chest, it can be received from any chest in the game, thankfully not requiring the player to constantly transport what they want to save or forget where they put some of the more important items. This allows players to stockpile items that may be enhanced through combination, namely the herbs. Herbs are this game's recovery item, and they come in 3 colors: green, red, and blue. The player's health is divided into 4 levels: fine, yellow caution, orange caution, and danger, along with the special condition poison, where your health slowly ticks down over a period of time. Green herbs will heal a player by about 1 level, but they can be enhanced by mixing them with other herbs. 2 greens will heal more, 3 greens will fully heal, green plus red will fully heal, but the red herbs cannot be used alone, and blue herbs also can't be used alone, but when mixed with green, they cure poison. All of these options allow for different approaches to different scenarios at different times in the game. What if there's a boss coming up? You probably want green and red, but that might be a bit too much because you don't think you're going to get hurt that bad, so maybe you only need 2 green for this situation. Or maybe there's lots of poison enemies coming up, so you need a lot of blue herbs to carry with you. Possibly the most important items to consider though are the ink ribbons. These ribbons are used to save the game, and like with most other resources, they are limited. This provides a whole new layer of tension to players when they ask themselves, should I use an ink ribbon now just in case something dangerous is coming up, or do I want to risk going a bit further at the possible cost of losing everything I've done up to this point? And yeah, it is super annoying to die and lose all the progress you made since your last save, but it does make for a great incentive to take things slow and carefully, just as one would in a real scary situation, thus brilliantly adding horror elements to the gameplay itself. And even if you do die, it really isn't that big of a problem, because you're probably not going to lose that much progress unless you're trying to prove how big your balls are and you didn't save in the last 2 hours. But what's really incredible is that death isn't actually the worst possible thing that could happen to you. What's really scary is whenever you use all the limited ammo that you could find, and now you have to progress further using a mixture of evasion tactics and a weaker weapon. Combat in classic Resident Evil games is nothing new. You equip a weapon, you turn to face the enemy, and then you unload into them, just like any gun from any game ever. Different weapons have different levels of usefulness, and some weapons are only available to certain characters. You begin the game with only a knife and a handgun. Now the knife has one very specific use that it does very well.
It's just right there in that inventory box and you never take it out.
Seriously, the weapon's worthless. Even on just common zombies, you'd have to be lucky or really skilled to get a kill with it, and it doesn't provide that much knockback or damage. And if a zombie is close enough to you for you to stab it, then you're probably going to get grabbed and hurt anyway. I only managed to kill a zombie with a knife with several quick strikes from behind, so it is possible, but it's a very specific situation and probably not even worth having in your limited inventory. The handgun's pretty standard. It fires quickly and deals moderate damage from long distances. The shotgun is great for controlling crowds, but as you play, you might also learn the trick of aiming up at a zombie's head once it gets close enough, and you can blow its head off in one shot. This never stops feeling good to do. Specific to Jill's campaign is the enjoyably named bazooka that fires specific rounds that do different kinds of damage to different enemies. There are grenade rounds that seem to wreck everything they hit, and there are fire rounds that are great for plant life. And lastly, there are acid rounds which are really effective at killing living things.
It's really powerful, especially against living things.
This weapon is another reason why I feel Jill's campaign is better, because of the fun of using this weapon, as well as the variety that it wants you to prepare for. Next is the flamethrower, a limited use item that is only found by Chris in the mines area, and it's actually really bad. This weapon is mostly used against hunters and a giant spider boss, both of which you have to be right on their ass with the flames or they'll almost instantly get a cheap hit in on you. Lastly is the Magnum. This gun is hidden and isn't even required to be picked up, but it does deal a great amount of damage to anything you use it on, making it especially great for bosses. For the first half of the game, the combat isn't particularly difficult. The difficulty came in maintaining a supply of ammo. Because of this, it's not often smart to kill every single enemy that you come across. If you can avoid an enemy, then you probably should. This adds a new layer of complexity to the gameplay, where players must choose what enemies live and which enemies die, which also involves learning the best ways to avoid these enemies. A player also has to consider that any damage dealt to an enemy does not stick around as the player leaves the room and comes back, meaning that if you're about to fire 5 shots into a zombie, then there's no reason to stop, because leaving will ensure that you've wasted your precious ammo. By mastering these techniques, players can save up health and ammo, which is important because halfway through the game, hunters appear. After returning from the greenhouse area, nearly every room where there were once zombies in the mansion now has those zombies replaced with hunters. Enemies who are much faster and deadlier than the undead monsters. Even with the most powerful weapons, these guys can be very difficult to hit, and they have a crazy amount of invincibility frames in most of their animations. The other enemies aren't nearly as bad. Cerberus can be knocked down by any weapon, and it can be kept down by a simple rhythm of shooting him right after they get back up, and you can hear them growl. Neptunes are a pain in the ass, but you don't have to deal with them for very long, and they can be run past. Bees are a joke. I don't even know why they're here. They are so worthless. As long as you are moving, they will never hit you. Same thing with the crows, they are worthless. When it comes to chimeras, it's probably just smart to run around them, because in the areas that they appear in, they never stop spawning. No reason to kill them, so you might as well just run around them. Lastly would be the bosses. First would be Yawn. The first time you encounter him, you're just supposed to run past him, although that may not be clear right off. But the second time you fight him, you actually do have to kill him. Yawn is a real piece of shit who can not only trap you in the corner with his long body, but he can frequently attack you as well as poison you. You have to bring health to this Yawn fight, and you have to be constantly healing, because you are not fast enough to run away from him, and you're not strong enough to kill him. He will hit you, and you're going to have to recover from it, and you just pray that you don't get poisoned. Plant 42 is a boss that you don't have to fight if the correct actions are performed. As Jill, Barry can run in with the flamethrower to save you, but Chris always has to fight the plant. Since Chris doesn't have Bazooka's flame rounds, he has to make use of the shotgun for this fight. So it turns out that the best way to handle the fight is just aim up and keep shooting. Sometimes you heal. It's really anticlimactic. There is a giant spider in the mines called the Black Tiger, who after being attacked, immediately jumps to the side and sprays acid. Her speed compared to your own fairly sluggish controls are really unfair, and it seems like this is a boss fight that was not properly thought out, this control scheme. Technically, you don't have to fight her. If you were somehow fast enough to remove the webbing on the door behind her, you can run right through, but it's really unlikely that you're going to be able to do this, especially for a new player. This is probably the best use I found for the flamethrower in Chris's campaign, but even then, the fast attack damage makes her jump left and right constantly, and you'll get attacked as much as you attack her. And then the big bad of the game, the Tyrant, has two different boss fights. The first one is extremely simple and easy. You just run around in circles and you don't let them get too close to you. The only way that that's going to happen is if you get greedy. The second fight is only in the good endings, and here he poses a huge threat. He will run at you at high speeds and knock the crap out of you. He also has a surprisingly high turn radius when charging at you, making your evasion techniques take priority over dealing damage. Once enough damage is dealt, the pilot of the helicopter, Brad Vickers, will drop a rocket launcher for you to finish the fight in one final direct hit. Overall, the combat is fairly varied, and thanks to all the weapon and monster types, there's actually a lot to unpack here. Especially for such an old game, it's interesting to see just how much they managed to get right on their first try. It's not all perfect, but the combat system is great, and it makes sense for them to have continued using it for future titles. Unlike nowadays, where our resourcefulness with ammo comes from our own ability to shoot, classic Resident Evil treats it more as a sort of puzzle, with each bullet being a piece in the grand scheme of things that need to be considered. The fear didn't come from the horrible monsters that were attacking you, it came from the fact that you have 7 bullets left and you haven't saved in an hour. Excluding a few select fights, it also meshed well with how the game presented itself. The easiest way to identify what qualifies as a classic Resident Evil game is how it plays. All classic Resident Evil games are played in a sort of top-down perspective with various fixed cameras. Thanks to the camera not moving around and needing to reveal the area from different viewpoints, the developers were able to pre-render each background, giving the environment more detail than most games were able to provide back then. This was big, but unfortunately, nowadays these backgrounds are pretty barren, uncanny, or even outright ugly. Sometimes an area is missing enough detail to be interesting, and sometimes the background can be difficult to read, making it difficult to maneuver around or pick up that one obviously pick-upable pixel. It's right there! Pick it up! You can't pick it up! It's right there! It's flashing! I see it! Look at it! It's annoying! It's not the most intuitive of backgrounds, and it clearly needed to be worked on. Specifically the mines area. This area is unbelievably ugly, almost to the point of it genuinely hurting my eyes. Everything is this sickly greenish yellow color and the stone walls look unusually blocky, making it extremely difficult to see items or even pathways. Despite the flaws though, they still make great use of camera position and musical cues to raise the tension in players. I'm sure everyone who's played this game originally fondly remembers this scene. Starting from a position where the camera is right next to the window in dead silence, and ending with a loud crash and loud music blasting in your face, along with a real threat of a fast and dangerous enemy, causes this to be one of the most unexpected and effective jump scares ever. Now, I'm not a music kind of guy, so I can't really tell you whether or not a musical track is good or bad.
Except this one's bad.
But luckily, for the most part, I don't have to. Resident Evil takes advantage of a lot of ambient tracks. When the game isn't taking advantage of complete silence, then it'll usually have a simple repeating musical track to match whatever tone it's trying to make. Or it'll have ambient noises of what's happening in the background. Like, take this ambient track whenever you step outside in any area. You get the rustling sound of nature, along with the howling of the zombie dogs that chased you into the mansion in the first place, constantly reminding you that just outside the walls of the mansion there's a predator searching for his next meal. Sounds great, right? Yeah, well, by constantly I mean constantly, because that howling sound effect happens like every 3 seconds and it never stops. But for the most part, the music does its job. Especially the safe room music. Whenever you open up a new door and you hear that easily identifiable relaxing beat, then it's a huge relief. One of the biggest additions for tension is the iconic transition between rooms. After you open a door, you are forced to watch a cutscene of the door opening before entering the other room. There are several things I'm willing to defend with my heart and soul about classic Resident Evil, but this is something I'm really torn about. Okay, on one hand, these have the opportunity to offer both extreme tension for what's about to come up, as well as relief when you manage to escape from something chasing you, and also allows a bit of downtime for you to catch your breath or prepare for a fight. When entering the Black Tiger boss fight, you're greeted with a loud stinger that tells the player that shit is about to go down. And that is a great use of these transitions. The problem comes in every other time that they're used. When you know you've cleared a room and you're having to backtrack for a puzzle or an item or something, you will probably have to sit through these transitions nearly back to back, and then they can become noticeably tedious. I wouldn't blame anybody if they said that they tried to play the game and they couldn't get past the door animations, but it has practical use. It covers up the load transition between rooms, and when looked at it from that perspective, it's kind of a clever way to cover it. Because of the camera's sudden change of perspective depending on where the player is in the room, the game has to utilize tank controls. Or, as everyone who I ever talked to on the subject likes to call it, the worst thing about old Resident Evil games. I'm sorry, but this really bugs me. People often like to point out that the controls for the old Resident Evil games are archaic and that they're the biggest repellent for new players trying to play these old games, but that is seriously bullshit. It isn't that difficult of a control scheme, and it merely requires a small amount of time to adjust accordingly. I've forced some of my friends that had never touched a classic Resident Evil game to sit down and play these older games, and they, within an hour, were able to fully adjust to the tank controls. If you honestly believe these to be difficult to maneuver, then you either didn't play for over an hour or are a hell of a slow learner. It really is simple. Pressing up makes you go forward, down makes you go backwards, and left and right make you turn in the corresponding directions. There are plenty of things wrong with the classic Resident Evil games, but the tank controls aren't one of them. They mesh perfectly with the perspective and the fixed camera angles, and they are all designed to work together. So imagine this. You're moving forward in your video game. Let's say for this example, moving right. And then boom! Suddenly, the camera changes on you. Now if the movement of your character was based on camera position, then when the camera changes, you're going to be moving in a direction that you weren't anticipating. But if you have tank controls where the character's movement is based on the character's position itself, then there's not going to be any difference in the movement of the character when the camera changes position. That's why tank controls are so important to Resident Evil. And sure, I guess you could argue that if they got rid of the fixed camera angles then they wouldn't need the tank controls, but then that would throw a wrench into everything else that the game is set up for. Aesthetic, enemy placement, item management, all of these things are reliant on the fixed camera angles. Now, to move on to one of the most notable flaws with the gameplay, the controls. Wait, what? Okay, so I know I just went on a tirade trying to defend the tank controls in the classic Resident Evil games, and I still stand by that. The problem with the first Resident Evil game is that they don't actually have any of the quality of life changes that were introduced and maintained in the sequel. Since the player's perspective can be a bit wonky depending on the camera's placement and how clear the background is, judging and aiming and hitting targets can be very difficult. Now this really bites the game in the ass when it comes to enemies like Cerberus and Hunters. These guys can be a real pain in the ass to kill, and if you miss that initial shot to knock them down, then they will be right on you, and you will have to awkwardly turn and possibly aim down to save yourself. This especially applies to Hunters because they have this nasty habit of running circles around you and quickly jabbing at you after each shot. The game is also missing any kind of a quick turn, meaning that if you need to get the fuck out of a scenario, then you're gonna have to slowly turn your ass around and pray you have enough time. Boss fights suffer from these controls most of all, as what one would normally expect to be a climactic fight turns into the player just standing still and firing while stuck in a corner for a majority of the fight, stopping only every few seconds to heal. With how sluggish your controls are and how fast and big the enemies are, it really isn't worth running around the arena to slowly turn back and try and hit them, since they're probably on your ass already. The first Tyrant fight changes things up a bit by having you run first, then stand around and shoot. Really, I'd only call one boss fight in this entire game good, and that'd be the final fight with the Tyrant during the good ending. It's the only big fight that requires skill to actually be able to read and then avoid the upcoming attacks. I just don't think this game's control scheme was made for a majority of these boss fights. Bosses range from too easy because they don't attack enough, to too hard because they attack way too often and the sluggish control scheme can't keep up, and it only succeeds at finding that middle ground once. This problem of poor aiming control was remedied by the inclusion of the auto-aim feature, a key improvement to the controls that was bizarrely taken out of the North American release and then re-added to the game in the director's cut version. The director's cut of Resident Evil is a crazy mess of specifics. First, it's great that they re-added the auto-aim that it desperately needed to become playable. It should have never been removed in the first place, but yay, they put it back. The director's cut also gave the supporting characters new costumes to pair up with the main cast, as well as a few handy features like a handgun that has a small percentage to instantly kill a zombie, and a beginner mode for quick speedruns or for babbies. And it was also supposed to add the uncensored footage that was used in some of the cutscenes, and it was marketed as such, but for some reason it was shipped to North America and Europe still lacking this content. Despite that, the director's cut version of the game is still probably the best option if you want to play Resident Evil. But if you're planning on playing Resident Evil Director's Cut, you have to make sure it's not the Director's Cut DualShock version, also known as the Greatest Hit version. This version adds support for the PlayStation DualShock controller, but it completely changes the soundtrack. This new soundtrack is composed by a man who claimed he was deaf at the time, and then later revealed that not only he was not deaf, but he didn't even write the music. The result is this horrible mess of audio that, while hilarious to listen to and look back on, really does become irritating in-game, and it takes away from the experience. Honestly, it's not all bad, it just really doesn't match the tone. Listen to this next track and tell me they don't hear something more like Final Fantasy or an old school JRPG rather than a survival horror game. Also, this version still lacks the footage that they promised. It still doesn't have it. They had 2 chances at this and they forgot to do it again. but it does have everything else in the first director's cut version, including a new advanced mode that rearranges every single item and enemy in the game to give it even more replay value, and it is supposedly more difficult. Speaking of difficulty, so, as I said before, the game is split up into two different campaigns, Chris's and Jill's. Now, this isn't just a lame attempt to try to make the game seem longer than it is, but it's actually a hidden difficulty choice. Jill's campaign is filled with plenty of conveniences that really help the player, like Barry saving her in the shotgun room, or Barry saving her from Plant 42, or Barry saving her from the hole, or Barry giving her ammo on several different occasions. Really, it's just a lot of stuff involving Barry being a cool bro. She also gets more powerful weapons and a larger inventory than Chris. Chris doesn't get any of that. Instead, he gets the convenience of an extra key to worry about, and it takes up an extra slot in his smaller inventory. Jill's campaign is designed with a fairly circular pattern, at least at first. While players may get lost along the way, the optimal route is extremely simple until headed outside, with few enemies blocking the path at first and acquiring very powerful weapons very early. Chris's campaign has a slight detour and it causes the shotgun to be locked away until later. The shotgun is also his main weapon, as the ammo for the Magnum isn't plentiful enough for common enemy use and the bazooka doesn't exist. For regular zombies, this does make the game easier, but once hunters get involved, the game's difficulty is doubled. Jill also gets a lockpick right at the beginning of the game because she's
The master of unlocking.
This lockpick is used to easily open small locks, but poor Chris, the ever unfortunate soul that he is, has to find small keys spread around the mansion to open these locks, and yes, these keys will take up room in his inventory. Chris doesn't get things easy. When he receives help from his partner Rebecca, it's never items or weapons. It's either to solve a puzzle or to fix a mistake he made. And this is great. The game definitely seems to want you to play through Jill's campaign first, so you can get the gist of things, learn what to expect and at what time and place, and then once that's completed, then you can test your survival skills in a harder mode. That applies again whenever you consider the arranged mode in the director's cut version. If there is any kind of difficulty trade-off between the two campaigns where Jill actually has something harder than Chris, that would probably be trying to get the good ending. In both campaigns you have to gather the MO discs, and with Chris's petite pockets it can be annoying, but what really stands out are the partner interactions. As I said before, Chris can need to save Rebecca at one point, but that isn't required if you make her come to the greenhouse. But Jill has one scene where you have to perform an action that seems to go against everything else the game is trying to say. Right after the yawn fight, Jill and Barry find a hole, and Jill jumps into it to investigate. Barry then drops the rope that she climbed down in on, and he says that he'll come right back with a new one. Right in front of Jill is a grave with a secret passage that is just begging to be explored. Also, after beating the game and seeing that Barry was being blackmailed by Wesker, it would be fair to assume that Barry just dropped the rope on purpose to do Wesker's bidding. That would have been an easy way to get rid of Jill. It's believable. But as it turns out, Barry actually does return with the rope, and the game wants you to ignore the big honkin' grave that's right in front of you and just stand around for a few minutes. If you don't wait, then at the end of the game, right before everyone escapes, Barry dies for some reason. This easy mistake can cost you a good ending and force you to replay the entire game over again, and it was very infuriating when I experienced this. But Chris's campaign had no such trouble. The last thing that really tries to push the difficulty is the incentive to be fast, because even in its first entry, Resident Evil knew how to treat its dedicated players. After completing the game for the first time, you will be given a key to a room on the first floor that allows Chris and Jill and the respective partners, if you're playing on the director's cut, to change their outfits. Then, upon completing the game in under 3 hours, you would receive a rocket launcher with infinite ammo, a weapon that completely breaks the game in half by making everything die in one hit, and it's a total blast to use. This is a great incentive to not only replay the game, but to push yourself as a player even further without the forced difficulty of a harder mode. All of these gameplay elements combine to make a game that, while initially seems linear, actually allows for individual experience based on how the player would handle each given situation and the items given to them. Each playthrough grants the player knowledge about the game and how to become more efficient each time they replay it, which over time can lead to perfect runs. Watching speedruns of these classic Resident Evil games is incredibly fascinating because unlike other games where the end is usually reached through glitches, Resident Evil games consist of a series of precise steps that have been refined over years to create the most effective actions possible in the least amount of time. Okay, so that's kind of what all of speedrunning is. But Resident Evil usually falls more in the line of the in-game rules. It's just really interesting to see a game be played perfectly in the way it was meant to be played. No tricks, just skill. It really is incredible to see what all Capcom managed to accomplish in the first game of their series. Despite only being around 4 to 6 hours long in one playthrough, the game manages to add several changes and incentives to replay it, making it actually last anywhere from 8 to 20 hours long, possibly more if you're playing the director's cut. However, while it is impressive for its time, this is a Resident Evil game that I would say is actually kind of worth skipping. A bit of an unsurprising spoiler to anybody who's going to be sticking with me for the sequels, but every game after this one does everything better. Its plot really isn't that interesting and can be predicted by anybody new to the series. The controls are really unrefined and cause an already sluggish control scheme to become unfortunately detrimental. The pre-rendered backgrounds are barren and at times incredibly ugly, and none of them stand up to the graphical improvements we have today, giving them a real uncanny effect. Some of the enemies are overpowered while some are underpowered. Some of the requirements for a good ending are too vague. Its greatest feature is actually an aspect of it that is so bad it's good. And even then, it's a 20-year-old game. You can just watch all the hilarious cutscenes online. It really is a solid starting point that just needs time to improve. It's important to understand how this game influenced its sequels as well as the survival horror genre as a whole. But as is, by today's standards, I'd say that this game is worth skipping, especially because, and you probably already know this, it was remade. And the remake is fucking sexy. I give it a 6 out of 10. It's good for what it is, but still heavily flawed. So, join me next time as I talk about Resident Evil's highly anticipated sequel, Resident Evil 2. Hey, so this is a new thing I wanted to try. I love discussing movies and video games, and I figured where else would be a great place to start than at the analysis of one of my favorite games ever. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed talking about it. Feedback is always appreciated, and I hope to do more of these in the future, possibly branching out from just the Resident Evil series, but also doing like movies and theories or literally whatever comes to mind. Huge thanks to anybody who's going to be sticking it out with me, and huge thanks to anybody giving me a chance on my first video. I know this video is kind of long, but since it was the first video in the Resident Evil series, I feel like I needed to boil it down to its bare essentials and try to talk about every aspect in as much detail as possible. Thankfully, when it comes to the sequels, I don't think I'm going to need to go into as much detail and we can focus in on the story. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a nice day.
Jill, take a look at this. I'm the computer. Oh my God.